Hey YouTube, this is the 7th episode in the Ukrainian mercenary series, which is being done in order to raise and increase awareness for Miss Ashley Oosthuizen, a lovely, beautiful young woman who continues to serve a life sentence inside of a Thai prison that was given to her at only the age of 21. So if you have not already subscribed, liked, shared, please do that now, because the only reason that I was fighting in Ukraine, that I made websites, wrote books, and so much more has been and continues to be to get Miss Oosthuizen out of prison. So the last episode left off with my squad being assigned our first assault mission, which was supposed to be aimed at an enemy-held hedgerow just outside a village called Doroshenka. We were supposed to attack the Russians that were in this position, drive them into the village, and then let the Ukrainian regular forces expel them from there. However, once we made it to our forward operating position at the abandoned grain silo, our squad leader Jay counteracted those orders and instead split the mission up over 3 nights, where the first 2 nights we would do a patrol to find the best route of infiltration, and then the third would be our actual assault on the Russian position. And so that first day, right, the first night, Jay, his half of the squad went out. That following morning when they came back in, there was a briefing, and that's when we found out that Vitali had gotten turned around and they weren't able to make it to their designated point. So we were going to have to go further when we went out the night coming up. And that's not to disparage Vitali, by the way, his getting turned around. It's really difficult to lead men at nighttime in enemy-held position that you've never been in before when you're only using hand signals. But nevertheless, that's what happened, and that's one of the reasons why our squad, or our half of the squad, ended up leaving 2 hours earlier that night. So we left at 9 instead of 11 so that we could have more time to make up for the ground they didn't get to cover. And so that day, while Jay and their squad were sleeping, we had, my half had not had to do anything. We slept like normal. And so I went out and explored the grain silo. I went up to the roof of the building that we were in, which was at least 15 stories high. Just a staircase took you from the bottom to the top. And once you got to the top, there was a little intelligence cell of Ukrainians, 3 or 4, that had some really nice electronics equipment up there. And outside on the actual roof was really cool because there was a telescope that you could use to observe the enemy-held positions from. And so it was a really nice vantage point to be able to basically see visually where we were supposed to be going and our ultimate objective as far as that village of Doroshenka. And beyond that, I went around and found, huge doors behind which was all sorts of things, including handy things like a chair, right? It's really nice to have a chair to sit on, because other than that, I simply had cardboard laying on the ground, and on the ground was then my sleeping bag. And so, you want to sit sometimes. So I was able to find a chair, found a shower room, which looked like a set out of that horror movie Hostel. It was beyond filthy, and the water that came out of it was freezing, really, almost ice as it came out. But what I did is I found a jug, a clear jug, and so I went and filled up that jug with that ice cold water, right, in the mornings, and then I would go put it in the sun, and then by like 3 or 4 that afternoon, it would actually be lukewarm. So then that's how I would rinse off outside and take showers. A lot of guys didn't take any showers, but I myself, after 2 or 3 days, I really wanted to take a shower. And so that is what I did so that I didn't have to take those ice baths. And then other than that, the thing that stood out the most was this dilapidated poop shack right beside the railroad tracks that ran into our silo. So our industrial complex had train tracks that ran right into it, so that when it was in operation, trains would come up to those chutes and just be loaded with whatever the seeds or the grains were directly from these buildings. And so right next to these tracks was, again, a shit house, basically, that was just corrugated rusty iron. And you walked up to it, before you even got to it, the swarm of flies was there, and when you looked inside, there was just it was just covered in urine and feces and old toilet paper and flies. And then the floor was just a piece of sheet iron that had a hole, I guess, just cut with some sort of torch through it, and so it's just like a poop hole. and you just were supposed to go there and squat down and poop through this hole in this little shack outside, and completely unprotected from the artillery that was regularly going off in the town right next to us, because again, we were a regular target for the Russian shelling even before they realized that we were an actual forward operating base. And so it was just too much for me. I took one look at it and I was like, no, there's got to be a better way. And sure enough, there was. I went around, continued my scavenging, and found a nice iron metal pail. And once I found that pail, earlier I found another part of the complex where they used to do, I guess, machine work on automobiles or vehicles. And so the place underneath where the mechanics could go to be underneath the cars, there was like a corridor that was subterranean. And so I just took this bucket. Once again, if you're afraid of the dark, you would be petrified. But this is where I took this bucket so that I could then have my own private bathroom, as it were. So I could have a place to go and poop, you know, privately. Some people, the Ukrainians, really, none of our guys. You know, the Ukrainians, I really like Ukrainian people. And I will say, obviously, the soldiers of Ukraine, they're coming from a lot of the very remote rural places. And so the city, like the people that you meet in Kiev are way different than the people you meet in Huliopol, for example. But they would just, you know, they'd go to the other corner of the silo and they would just shit on the ground, which you really can't blame them, again, because especially at nighttime, you want to really try and go out to that outhouse, you're just going to end up caked in really in dookie. It's going to be disgusting. And it's night, you know, it's like you're really close to the enemy positions. It's like, I don't want to go there at nighttime, but, you know, so I get it, but that's why I had a bucket. And so that's what I did. But anyway, the day went by, sort of, you know, frivolously, just sort of going around doing things like this, finding the Ukrainian command post, talking to the Ukrainians, doing things like this. And then the evening came and I went to bed. I don't know, I went to bed like 5:30, something like that, because obviously I was going to go out all night and we were going to leave at 9. And so I woke up at 8:30 to start getting ready because we were going to leave at 9. And I started suiting up, right? So I got all my stuff on. There'll be pictures of this video. And then once I did everything and I was ready to go, I went over to the staging area, and there was another Ukrainian there who was coming with us. His name was George, and he spoke really good English. He was sort of dark-skinned and very soft-spoken. Hey, you know, I'll work on the accent, but he was like underneath of Vitali, because Vitali really didn't speak good English. And so this way, one of the issues that Vitali had the first night going out with Jay's half of the squad was because the communication. As soon as things started to not go perfectly, Vitali didn't really have the ability to communicate with Jay what was going on or what they should do. And so to remedy that, we were getting another Ukrainian liaison that was named George, and he was going to be with us to go out this mission, and I guess every mission, so that he could sort of be that translator between Vitali and us. And so we met up. Again, it's pitch black in this silo. We all have these red beam flashlights on. Everyone is kitted up, fully ready to go out in whatever happens. And when we get the word to do this, we all head out towards the end of the silo building where there's this iron door. And underneath this iron door is another metal plate that's loose. And so anytime someone steps on it, it's like a clang, clang, clang. And so that's all you hear as we start marching out. Clang, clang, clang. These big guys, heavy, ready in armor, ready to go out and do this mission. And so we're standing outside for just a minute. We got red beams on, and then suddenly two vehicles, like an SUV and a truck, they come over from the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainian command post. We're over on that area, and they have these blue headlights. The headlights aren't blue, but they've been taped blue, and they're low beams, so it cuts down on the light a lot, even more than the red beams we had on. And so once they part, we got inside the vehicles. As soon as we got in, red beams off, and then it's just pitch black, except for right in front of us, these vehicles that we were in. I was in a vehicle with this Ukrainian doctor named Doc, and then Vitali was the driver. I was behind Vitali. Kenny was beside me. Mitch was beside Kenny. I don't know who was in the back. I think it was a truck. Maybe we were in the SUV. I don't remember. But all you could see was maybe 5 meters in front of us. That was how far the headlight shone. So it was like really good for covert sort of nighttime driving. And as soon as we got in, we immediately started to head out, driving through this base. We're moving quick too. And the Ukrainians, they know what's up. No one has us stop, ask us what's going on. The base knows that we're going out on this stuff. And so the guys at the gate, they open it as we're driving. They close it as soon as we leave. And we start heading down this little country road that we had used to come in on. And Mitch, you know, he's like, hey, Kenny, you mind if we do a radio check? And Kenny's like, good shout, mate, good shout. And so they do a radio check. Everything's working. Kenny has a radio, Vitali has a radio, Mitch has a radio, and Gary has a radio. But during the mission, we're on radio silence. But we just need to make sure that they work before we go out, because, and obviously our radios connect with the Ukrainian command. They're supposed to, although they don't always. And so we drive for maybe 5 minutes, and then suddenly Doc busts a left, and we are heading off road now, these dirt roads, and we're driving dirt roads, bump, shaking, and we keep driving until eventually, like, we're not even on dirt roads. It's sort of like field grass, you know, not even tractor paths. I don't know, just straight off road, just grass. We're just driving on grass, you know. And so we're driving just on grass, and for another 10 or 15 minutes, I have no idea where we are. I have no idea how this guy knows where we're at. I'm thinking like, Jesus, we're in the lead vehicle any second, boom, you know. At least I won't know, right, when we hit a mine, because we're just literally just driving through the dark, like, just barely see it in front of us, going through grass. I'm just like, oh my God. But amazingly, not amazingly, you know, got to give props to Doc and the Ukrainians. They knew their stuff. We suddenly ended up at this intersection of like 3 fields, and there was this light pole, and that light pole was our the point where we entered at, where the operation commenced. And so once we got there, then the vehicle stopped. Okay, guys, we're here. And so, you know, we all like squeeze out, have to push each other out, right? Because we're actually not carrying any rockets this mission. It's just a patrol mission. But even still, the cars are small, and once you have all of the body armor and all of the weapons and everything on, you're very wide and big, and so it's very difficult to move into and out of vehicles, especially without falling. So we squeeze ourselves out of the vehicle. We get out, you know, Kenny, Vitali, he's talking. Kenny comes back. You're going to be behind me, Bode. Mitch, you know, Mitch is behind me, then it was Hogan, and then George, and then Gary was in the back, because again, Gary had a radio, and then Mitch behind me had a radio, Kenny in front of me had a radio, Vitali had a radio, so it was spread out well as far as the comms went. And as soon as we were basically in that column, the 2 drivers, Doc and whoever else, some other Ukrainian, they turned the vehicles around and they drove off, and we were left there in the, you know, nighttime, wherever, some field in Ukraine at the beginning of May, like May 5th, May 6th. It was still cold. You could see your breath when it, you know, came out of your mouth. And so we started to walk. Vitali, you know, let's go, guys. And that was basically it. After that, it was only hand signals alone. So a lot of this and a lot of halt once we got to certain points. But starting out, we were just walking to the left of us, there was this field of the rapeseed. And we were walking down this field very close together because it was so dark and we couldn't see. And so in daytime, you would want to obviously be spread out a really far distance, because if you step on an anti-personnel or an anti-tank mine and you're in close proximity to one another, you're going to take out multiple guys or even potentially the whole squad. And so we were really close together, which was not a good thing, but it was the first mission. I wasn't even really thinking about it, to be honest with you. I was just sort of like amped up on adrenaline, ready to go, just like, oorah, let's do it. But hindsight, right, 2020. And so we're moving, we're walking. We've already been to this place, so Vitali's moving quick, probably a kilometer at least, more probably closer to 2 kilometers, just this one side of this giant field of rapeseed that's almost head high now, like tall as my head, almost 6 feet, 2 meters. And so we get to the top of this initial side of the field that we got dropped off at, and then we turn left. So now we're going the top route. We're going, you know, across the top of this same field. And it was while we were going this route, it was this was a tractor path, and it was thick, like not mud that was gooey, but it was like walking through loose sand at the beach. And it was so long, and it was so far, and there were these sticks you had to step over and avoid because you couldn't fall, obviously you don't want to fall, make a lot of noise or something like that. And it was very tedious. And once we started getting halfway through, that was as far, I guess, as they had gotten the night before. And so then Vitali started to get really cautious, and he would, you know, call us to a halt. He wouldn't call us to a halt. He would do this, and then that would get passed back. Kenny, me, everyone else would pass it back, and we would halt, and then, you know, go into a column with one half facing off one side of the road, the other facing the other half, ready to fire. And I must say, it was during this time that those knee pads I got from Taylor really came to shine. And also later that they came to aggravate as well. So knee pads, I think they're clutch. They're really, really wonderful to have. But you must have them tightened correctly, because if you don't, they're going to wear down on you, especially if you run or just over time. And then you're left leaning over forward as you're walking in this formation, trying to pull them up above your kneecap with all this weight shifting around. It's very tedious. It's just not very good. But having said that, having knee pads so that when you do have to halt all the time and put all that weight down on your kneecap on hard earth, oh, it really makes a huge difference. And so I strongly recommend it. But nevertheless, we were halting a lot as Vitali would look up with Kenny with the thermals, and Kenny had the NVGs trying to make sure that we weren't walking into an ambush or anything like that. But eventually we made it to the end of the top half, or the top side of that field as well. And when we got to the end, there was a gap, maybe 20 meters across. And so we had to go one at a time, right? Clear that gap, even though it was nighttime, because it would have been a sniper's paradise or a machine gunner, or a wet dream. And so we cleared that gap, and then we turned left again. So basically, we've been doing an inverted capital U, okay? And so we went up, and then we went over, and now we're starting to go down again, the same field. And about a third way down on our right this time. So on our right side, there's a gap through, and you'll see all this in the maps. There's a gap through the hedgerow, and that gap through the hedgerow is what leads to the railroad track. And again, that railroad track, if you were to just get on it and then turn left and follow that railroad track, you would run directly into our forward operating position. But we were just going to cross over the railroad track, because over the railroad track and through the adjoining hedgerow, that's where the Russians are. And then past that, again, that's the Russian-held town of Doroshenko, which was our ultimate objective. And so once we got over there, things slowed down even more. Again, everything is on radio silence. Vitali's using hand signals. We're very closed up. We're very bunched together. It's very dark. The stars are out. You can see almost all of the stars, though, because there's no light pollution. We're out in the middle of nowhere. And so we decide it's time for us to cross over this railroad track, which is also difficult because of the steep embankments and the loose white gravel, right? Very loud. And so we cross over this open space, this open terrain, and once we cross over the railroad tracks, then from that point on, we're at a point where no one has been, even the Ukrainians, past that point. It is uncleared, nothing. We know nothing about it except what the maps and the drone footage have shown us. And so once we get over there, we find that it's like knee-high grass is what the terrain is. Knee-high grass with little baby trees interspersed throughout. You would almost call them groves, but not really. And then beyond that was the thick line of hedgerow, which we were supposed to find our way through to assault the enemy Russian position from. And so that's what we started trying to do. We were basically like a human centipede, with Vitali at the head and Gary no more than 10 meters back, right? So we're talking, okay, maybe a little bit more, but seriously, like a human centipede. We were all so close together, just following right after each other in the same footsteps, it should be noted, okay? And so we just right behind each other, and we keep trying to probe this hedgerow to find a way through, to find some path through. But everywhere we go, it's just thicket and brush and branches and bramble. And so we're not able to find any way through, even though we spend more than an hour trying to go and hit all these different points, but we can't find a way through. And so finally, right after however much time, Kenny comes back to me. He's like, "Hey, mate, you all stay here, Vitali, and, we're going to go and find a way through. We'll come back and get you." And so I'm like, okay, sure, roger that. And Kenny and Vitali, they turn around and they disappear into the darkness. And once they do, I turn around and I walk over to Mitch and I whisper to him, and then Mitch passes it back. And then we go into a defensive perimeter, right? So like a crescent. Because obviously we don't need to worry about behind us. We already come from that direction, but all of the ways in front of us and to our side, we have a guy, with an arc of fire facing in that direction. And then we basically just posted up. And some things that I remember very distinctly, number one is how loud things sound at nighttime. So we were sitting there, and I'm listening, everyone listening, right, to Vitali and Kenny try to find their way through this hedgerow, and they can't. They're having to make a path. So they're basically having to force their way through, and it's like, crack, like, it's so loud. I'm just like, oh my God, like, we're literally less than 500 meters from the Russians, and I'm just like, any second now there's going to be some machine gun that's going to open up, mortars coming in, like, we're just sitting here dead meat, and these guys are just, piddling their way through this hedgerow. So that was number one. But after 15 or 20 minutes, apparently they made it through because I didn't hear anything. And then another thing, I know I mentioned how I always was worried about running out of food, or how I always packed food with me on my missions, right? I would always bring lots of food, and it was no exception. Even this first mission, I brought a protein bar and some of those gambas or bombas, or I don't know, they're like Starburst over a tropical fruit candy over in Ukraine you can get, bombas, jambas, something like that. And so I remember I was laying there in the grass in this little grove facing the hedgerow, right, with my rifle, and I was hungry. And I wanted to get my protein bar, this chocolate protein bar, very yummy, that the Ukrainians, man, they gave us so many of these things, Jesus. And they gave us the hand warmers too. Oh, those are so clutch, I gotta say. They gave us those hot hands, and the first mission, I didn't use these properly. I didn't even use them at all, such a dummy. And I was numb. My hands, my fingers, after laying there, by the time morning came, I was so numb, I was like a block of wood. But then after that, I learned to take those hand warmers with me, and to put like one in each of my boots, and then like I'd have one to switch between my hands, as you know. Oh, those hand warmers are so clutch, really. And the other thing, I was trying to take out this, again, this chocolate protein bar. It was so loud, I felt like, I'm sure it was only loud because it was so close to me, but it was like the wrapper as I'm taking it out of my pocket. I'm trying, like a surgeon on the brain, like so slow, so careful, trying to open this thing up and keep observing and everything. And then I finally get it, and like I eat this, and then to slowly put it in my pocket with like no noise. It was just like a whole operation in itself. So I remember this. And then I remember also this time and every other time we were out on a mission, right? I would get hungry. I would always have an appetite. So then I took out these fruit candies, and I had like one, and then I was like, well, maybe Mitch wants one. So I sort of like moved over towards Mitch, because it had been a long time, right? I also just wanted to check on him. He's the guy next to me too, make sure he's not sleeping, whatever. Because I didn't know Mitch, right? I didn't have any reason not to doubt him, but at the same time, I just, I'm just covering myself too, and being polite. And so I moved over to him. He wasn't asleep, and I offered him this candy, and he didn't want it. He wasn't hungry, and no one ever wanted any. Whenever we were on a mission, every single time I would offer people something like Rich with his peaches, they would always say no. But I was always snacking on missions, really, except one time, and I'll get to that. But there was a good reason for it, right? Paracetamol, 1 gram of paracetamol, it was way too much. But anyway, so yeah, we were just posted up basically for hours, 3 hours probably, maybe even longer than that. And the first gray of light started to come in, and I heard murmurings, right? The guys, because they were started getting nervous because the light was coming, and we were so close, so close to the Russians. And so then Mitch came over to me this time, and he was like, "Hey, you think I should call them and like see where they're at?" And because he wanted, again, he didn't want to be the one to break radio silence. He wanted to sort of like check with me and see if I agreed, and then that way he could like sort of cover his back. But I was like, the Russians are so close. We haven't heard any gunshots. We haven't heard any shouting. So if something would have happened, we'd have heard. Let's wait another 30 minutes and then, for sure call him. And so, he's cool. He's in agreement. He goes back, takes his position. We keep laying there. And then before that time passed, we got in the radio from Kenny and Vitali telling us that they were coming up behind us and not to shoot. And so we're like, okay, right? Mitch came to tell me, I didn't have a radio. Mitch came to tell me this. I guess Gary spread the word as well. And so then another few minutes later, maybe 10 minutes later, I was signaled again. I turned around, and out of this morning, mist comes Vitali and Kenny walking down this little dirt path along the side of this railroad track that we hadn't seen the night before because it was so dark, but now we could see in this early morning light. And so we all stood up, and we got back into our original positions in our single file, and we started to follow them out. And it was, gray light getting dawn. And certainly by the time we made it back through the cut by the rapeseed field, the first top of, Sol Invictus of the sun was already coming up. And I must say, Ukraine is a very, very beautiful place. It's like those landscape paintings from the 1800s of old European countrysides. That's how it is. It's really exceptionally beautiful. You can't believe that there's a war going on. And so we basically, we just start to follow Kenny and Vitali out, and there's no adrenaline. We've been out all night. I'm tired by this point. And now, as we're going back, how far? I don't know, 10 kilometers, 12 kilometers. It was a really far way. My shoulders were on fire from how heavy my armor was, and all of my ammunition, and my rifle, and my backpack, my water, like everything. It was just terrible. I was in agony from how my shoulder was hurting, and even no matter how far I bent forward, it wouldn't take the weight off enough to stop it from burning. So those first couple missions at the end, they would really get rough on the shoulders because of that. And yeah, we just walked out the way we came in. Beautiful, beautiful morning, like band of brothers, this European countryside. And on the way out, we saw multiple Russian fighting positions inside the hedgerows that we had just come by the night before, because either the day before, the week before, I mean, I don't know, but the Russians had been in those same positions, and then they had pulled back closer to Doroshenko, which is where we were heading to now. So it was really, like visceral to just look over and see, like, yeah, okay, that's where they were, and we're moving back on them, and we're going to be pushing back on them even sooner now that we've finished finding our way in. Well, I didn't know yet, but once we got back to that light pole, thank God, and the vehicles got back and we climbed in, and I'm just like head on the window, and Kenny, first thing he does is start smoking a cigarette, which I can't stand people smoking beside me, but I didn't say anything, right? He earned a cigarette. And so I asked him, though, I was like, so did y'all find a way through? And he was like, yeah, mate, starts telling me about it, about how they found their way through the hedgerow. And once they made it to the other side, there was another field of rapeseed, and they couldn't see the Russians from where they came in at. So then they followed the field up until eventually they passed right by, I don't know, within 50 meters of the Russian position. They didn't know at the time, right? But later, I saw how close it was. I was like, oh my God. So they passed so close to the Russians. And there was this road, and the road curved around the end of this hedgerow, and it turned into like a footpath that went along the railroad. And so that is where we were going to use to go in and do our assault from. We were going to follow this footpath to the end of this, where the hedgerow ended, and then basically when you came around that bend, that hedgerow right in front of you, that's the Russians. And so that's where we were going to do our assault from. And so, Kenny's asking Vitali, like, yo, Vitali, is that? And Vitali's like, yeah, man, that's where. And so, I'm like, okay, cool. So everything worked out, everything's set, good to go. All right. I put my head on the windshield and, sort of just drowse. You really can't because you're shaking so much, but, whatever. And we get back to base and we have our debriefing where the squad's there, Matt, Jay, Vitali, everyone. We go through what we did and basically, conclude that we have completed all of the preliminary stuff that we needed to do in order to carry out this planned assault. And so the next night, so this was going to be the third night, right? The first night, Jay went out with Matt and half of our squad. The second night, Kenny went out with myself and the half of our squad. And now it was the morning of day 3, so obviously we were about to go to sleep. But then later that same day, we would wake up, we would eat, and then we would have a briefing, and then that night we would go out again. But this time we were going to go out as the whole squad, and the next morning we were going to assault the Russian hedgerow position. And so there was a long briefing. There was a briefing that happened after. So after that first morning briefing, we went to sleep. Vitali went to command. Then Vitali went to sleep, and we woke up in the afternoon. Milling about. But then later in the afternoon, I forget, 3, 4 o'clock, we had the briefing, which is where Jay, with Vitali, went over our plan for the coming assault. that had been decided upon and finalized based on our previous 2 nights patrols, and that was going to be relayed to us and before we went out and handled business. And so that is where I will pick up next week, with that briefing and then running that first assault with my squad for that enemy held town of Doroshenka. And remember, the only reason that I was in Ukraine fighting and doing all of this at all was strictly and only to raise publicity and awareness for Ashley Oosthuizen. That's the only reason that I do these videos. It's the only reason I learned how to code so I could make websites. It's the only reason that there's books coming out and being published. She's the only reason. So please, if you have not subscribed already, then do so. I am going to keep pushing until we get her out. It's almost 4 years. Next week we'll continue, and until then, just subscribe, like, share, and support me in trying to free Ashley Oosthuizen. So see you next week, and free Ashley.